pallet wood. It's common, cheap, and often ends up in the junk pile. Much of it is unusable. But if you get your hands on some pretty decent quality pallets, it can also be used to make some awesome projects. Even if you do find good pallets, however, you'll still often come away with pieces like this one. Solid and sturdy, but difficult to use in most projects. But what about a coat rack? Well, one thing I've found is that pieces of wood with live edges like these make phenomenal coat racks, and they're not even that hard to build. The project we'll be walking through in this video took me only about 2 actual hours of labor to build, not counting waiting for the polyurethane to dry. Ready? Let's go. The first thing to do is to clean up the piece. Although I really wanted the live edge intact, there are some pieces of wood, like large splinters and so forth, that do need to be removed. I simply felt around the board for any chunk of wood that was loose or not well attached and broke it off by hand. Then, I took a belt sander to the front and back of the wood. It's important to note here that the belt sander shouldn't be used a whole lot on the live edge, as it would damage the look. Belt sanders are simply too harsh for that type of use. Instead, I used a palm sander to take care of the live edge, paying close attention to make sure I wasn't damaging it. The aim is to smooth it down, not destroy it. Then, the palm sander was used to smooth the rest of the wood to a nice splinter-free, or mostly splinter-free, texture, doing as little damage as possible to the live edge. I'd say our piece is complete now. Next, I moved the piece down to the basement to apply some poly. All I'm using here is some basic oil-based polyurethane. I bought it for like $10 from Lowe's. I want to lather the poly on pretty thick, so it's important to get a lot on the brush and ensure the coat is smooth and consistent. All in all, that's not too difficult. The wood happens to be pretty thirsty and the poly took well to it. One thing that's important to note here is that the poly will drip down the sides of the wood, as well as any holes or crevices that may be present. That can pool up on the underside of the wood, making for unsightly clumps and bumps, especially if your wood is sitting flat on the ground like mine was. One way to counter this is to elevate the piece as you turn it over to apply multiple coats of polyurethane to both sides. I just used a couple metal brackets I had laying around. Once I completed one side and ensured all the small bubbles in the polyurethane were popped, I went over the opposite side with a paper towel to remove any poly that might have dripped down. Then, I set the board up on the metal brackets to keep it elevated, both for airflow and to prevent poly from pooling on the underside. As a side note, you can see another project, also made from pallet wood, taking form in the top right of the video. After applying 2 to 3 coats of poly to each side, thus rendering the wood very smooth and glossy to the touch, without roughness or splinters, I was ready to measure out the spacing for the hooks. This is one of the most important parts of the project. You want the hooks to be spaced between 8 and 12 inches apart. Any closer and coats and jackets won't have enough room. Too far apart and the coat rack won't have enough hooks to be useful. I went for an 8-inch spacing here between hooks. The wood piece was 36 inches long, so starting 2 inches in from the side, I would need to place tick marks every 8 inches. It's also important to make sure that the tick marks are the same height on the board. To accomplish this, I just measured up 2 inches from the bottom of the board, which was the straight edge of the board, and then made tick marks every few inches, and basically after that I just connected them with a straight line across the piece. That ensures a line that is mostly parallel to the bottom of the board. That way the coat racks won't be angled wrongly. I then measured along that line and placed a tick mark every 8 inches, starting 2 inches in from the side of the board. A bit of a side note here, and kind of a funny one, I had a major filming fail here. I meant to film above to show you guys my point of view, but I literally stuck my head in the way the whole time because I didn't know I was on camera. Oh well, that's trial and error for you. Enjoy looking at what will someday probably become my bald spot. But I digress. I reshot the procedure from the side, but I'd already made the tick marks, so it kind of looks a little weird, and that's why they're already there. You can see them on the video as I'm making the tick marks again, just to show you guys how I did it. As for the hooks themselves, the coat hooks I used came from Amazon. They're basic rustic hooks, which makes a good fit for this project. The line I drew represented where the top part of the coat hook base would go. Spacing the hooks every 8 inches, I marked where the screw holes would need to be and drilled them. And after that, it's just a matter of lining up the hooks and putting the screws in to tighten them down. Although my wood piece was thick enough for this to not be a problem, I have used wood pieces in the past where these screws actually poked out the back and they had to be sanded down, because the last thing you want to do is tear up your wall in more places than where you're going to actually use the screws to mount the piece. So be mindful of that for sure. Once the hooks are in, it's almost done. The only major thing left to do is erase the pencil line and drill the holes for the mounting screws. As for the mounting screws, the ones I'm using are just regular 2-inch wood screws. They're deep enough to go through the wood and get a good fix into the studs in the wall. For most folks, stud spacing in the walls is 16 inches on center, and the 2 hooks immediately around the center one are exactly 16 inches apart, since the hooks themselves are spaced 8 inches apart. To put in the screws, I'm drilling holes right above the base of the 2 hooks and right in the middle of the loop that they form on the top. I didn't really think this through the first time because, as it turns out, I placed the holes too close to the base of the coat hooks. That meant that the screw heads, when trying to screw them in, were too big to fit through the coat hook loop since I put it so close to the bottom. So I had to drill new holes for the mounting screws about a ½ inch higher than what I originally intended. This also leaves unused holes in the wood, so that's a bit of a bummer. Oh well, this is pallet wood, and it already has nail holes in it anyway, as well as some other knots and imperfections, and those imperfections are part of the look. I guess I could go back in later and touch up those unused screw holes with a little bit of wood putty. Anyway, I drilled the new holes, put the screws through, and then widened the holes a bit with the screwdriver. The coat rack is now finished and ready to mount. I had to unmount another coat rack I made, also out of pallet wood, in order to put this one up. And look at that! Nice and simple, with a basic rustic design. Since I drilled the holes for 16-inch stud spacing and it turns out that my basement studs are actually 24 inches on center, I had to mount this into drywall, and I didn't use drywall anchors. So I don't recommend putting too much weight on it as it stands right now. Even so, it was able to hold 5 large coats and jackets without breaking too much of a sweat, if a coat rack can break a sweat, that is. If it was screwed into a couple of studs, I'm betting this thing could probably hold 25 or 30 pounds quite easily. Well, that does it for this video. Thank you so much for watching. Stay tuned for more content soon to come.